Well, I agree with all of it. Instead of the word obsessive, I would probably say relentless because it has been the driver of U.S. foreign policy since 1992. The idea that there's a unipolar world and now the U.S. is going to run everything with the demise of the Soviet Union. And so I think that this was really planned step by step, and it's all gone absolutely disastrously because these people are not very clever, by the way. They really are not very clever. They have no sense of proportion and what they're doing. And of course, they denigrated Russia's capacity to respond to anything that the United States put up. So they got everything wrong relentlessly, but they have created exactly the formula to destroy Ukraine. This is the formula that says there's no path to peace because the West will do exactly what Russia will fight to the end for because it's an existential position for Russia, and that is not having NATO on its 2,000-kilometer border by being positioned in Ukraine. So this has been such a shit show. I don't know if we're allowed to say that on the air,
Yeah.
but it's unbelievable. Trying to understand why is, I think it was basically a consistent underestimation of what Russia would do at every stage. So this was kind of the neocons by their own bluster and blather and arrogance and ignorance, thinking that they could do whatever they wanted without any opposition. And President Putin called their bluff. And now they went to Vilnius without an idea in their heads about how to end this war. But what's stunning, what we're going to see, actually, since this is not going to be settled at the negotiating table in the coming weeks or months, this is obvious. The simple truth seems to be the one that Jake Sullivan and Biden said a few weeks ago, and that's the U.S. has run out of ammunition to give to Ukraine. And if that's the case, which is what the U.S. has said, well, it's just going to have an absolutely disastrous outcome for Ukraine. But Vilnius was without a single constructive idea, without any impulse whatsoever to actually help save Ukraine. They don't care. And I think another part of this, obviously, is that from the U.S. security establishment calculation, what does it matter how many more thousands or tens of thousands of people die? That's never been their calculation as long as it's not U.S. body bags. And this is part of the profound cynicism of all of this. Not an idea, not a constructive approach, not a word about peace or negotiation or discussion, nothing except a formula guaranteed to be more disaster.
Absolutely. Can I just ask you one particular point which stood out for me about your article, which is something I didn't know, that in 1992, it seems that there were private discussions within the Bush administration about how to expand NATO eastwards. This is at the very time that, well, shortly after the time when the Russians were told that wasn't going to happen. It's also the time when people like yourself were preparing to go to Russia to work to find ways of changing Russia in some ways, integrating it with the West, building up the relationship between Russia and the West. And you've spoken on our programs about how you would telephone people in the White House and in the administrations, the various administrations, saying, can I get help to do this in Russia, which has worked in Poland, and it wasn't happening? Do you think there's a linkage with this?
Oh, no, it's the same story. It's not a linkage. It is exactly the same story. I didn't understand it at the time. I actually, got engaged heavily with Russia in 1990, with Soviet Union when Grigory Yavlinsky was the economic advisor to Gorbachev, and he asked me for help and some suggestions because what I had suggested for Poland debt cancellation, emergency stabilization funding. I invented something called the Zloty Stabilization Fund, a currency stabilization fund. And just to give you an idea of what geopolitics was like, I know a lot about currency stabilization. That was my specialty. So I was helping Poland in its new government, the Mazowiecki government. And I had the idea literally one morning. It was the IMF meetings in September 1989. And I said, Poland needs a stabilization fund for its currency now that it's going to be making market reforms. And so I typed up a page of what a stabilization fund is from economic history. And I called Senator Robert Dole, who was the Senate Majority Leader. First, I called the Polish finance minister, who was in Washington in his first days ever as finance minister, and he was at the IMF meetings in Washington. And I said, Leszek, could I try to get you $1 billion today? And he said, well, yeah, of course, if you can do that, fine. So I called up the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Dole, and I said, could I come in, Senator? And he knew that I was advising Poland, so he brought me in, and I explained to him, this is what Poland really needs to avoid a hyperinflation. And he said, could you come back in an hour? And so I came back in an hour, and who was there? The National Security Advisor sitting in Senator Dole's office, General Scowcroft. And Senator Dole said, Mr. Sachs, could you explain to General Scowcroft your idea? So I handed him the page. I explained what currency stabilization is, how this was part of Keynes's insight from 1919, and why this was what Poland needed. And General Scowcroft said, well, we'll take a look at it. And Senator Dole said, call me at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, 5 p.m., I called Senator's office, and he said, Jeff, tell your friends that they've got their $1 billion. So that was one day. That was 8 hours. I thought, yeah, pretty damn good economist, that's really persuasive. And I had many other ideas, canceling Poland's debts and so forth. Basically, they were accepted, all of them. I thought, this is pretty good. This is how you're supposed to do stabilization. Poland stabilized, had a stable currency. After the collapse of the Eastern trade, Poland started growth in the middle of 1990 and then had 30 years of growth. Now, the Soviet Union, I should say Yavlinsky, was watching this. So he called, said, could I meet you in Warsaw? And we met, got to know each other a little bit. And I said, I'd be happy to help Gorbachev, whom I admired tremendously, by the way. I know many people do not and see the economic collapse and the collapse of the Soviet Union and all the rest. But Gorbachev was a man of peace and a man of incredible decency. And he wanted a common European home. And I loved the idea, and I got stuck with that idea, I have to say, for the next 33 years, because that's what we really need, not the barriers. So I said I would try to help President Gorbachev. We actually had a project at Harvard and MIT in the spring of 1991 to come up with a plan. I wrote a central part of it based on what Poland had done, which was stabilize its currency, avoid a hyperinflation, get its debts canceled, get a fresh start, begin economic growth. And the White House turned it down flat, immediately. And by the way, I wasn't the only person in this group. This was Graham Allison, who was dean of the Harvard Kennedy School at the time. Robert Blackwell, who became, very major figure in U.S. foreign policy. Stanley Fischer, who became many things, including vice president of the Fed, governor of the Israeli Central Bank, chief economist of the World Bank. It wasn't some bizarre group. It was pretty damn establishment, and we were saying help the Soviet Union avoid a financial collapse. Okay, zero. The White House said, basically, ridiculous. We're not going to help the Soviet Union, whether it's Gorbachev or not. Gorbachev fell. Gaidar, who was Yeltsin's economic advisor, called me in the fall, said, please come to the dacha outside of Moscow. We urgently need to talk about the financial situation. So I came in September 89. This is now September 91, and met with Gaidar. And interestingly, just as an example, the G7 finance deputies were coming to Moscow in November. And I know a lot about that. So I said to Yegor Gaidar, who's a wonderful person, tell them you need a standstill on debt payments. You're running out of reserves. Before everything explodes, you need a standstill. So I was with him in the room as the G7 deputies came in. Then he went into the room and I stayed on the outside. The meeting broke and he came out ashen-faced and said, Yegor, what happened? He said, they told me if we don't pay every dollar on time, we stop all aid immediately. The food shipments on the high seas, you pay every penny that's due. And Russia ran out of foreign exchange reserves in the first days of 1992. Now, if you have experience in finance, that means that's how hyperinflation starts. I went back to the White House and said, are you kidding? I went to the IMF. Look what Poland did. Nothing. I went to the Secretary of State, who said to me, Mr. Sachs, even if I agree with you, I just want to tell you, it's not going to happen. You're not going to get the aid. I was, of course, nonplussed. Russia was not exactly the enemy at that moment. Russia was at the end of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin said, we're done with this Soviet period. We want to be normal. And what happens in Washington? Absolute, complete unwillingness to do anything, but interestingly, unwillingness to do anything of the kind that they had just done for Poland. It was very confusing to me, frankly, because it was a little bit like a controlled experiment. I was the same economic advisor, it was the same recommendations, it was the same moment a year later. But what I was observing and did not understand at the time was the Cheney, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, neocon ascendancy, which was starting. And of course, I didn't realize it was going to become the Biden, Newland, everyone ascendancy. But I was watching something that was completely devoid of economics, completely devoid of just even a scintilla of empathy or understanding that you don't leave a major nuclear power in profound financial crisis, as was happening in 1992. And I was a student of John Maynard Keynes, and especially of what I regard as one of the most important books of the 20th century, The Economics of the Peace, which Keynes wrote in a disgusted mood in 1919 after the Versailles Treaty, saying, are you all crazy? You're creating the conditions for the next World War, for the next horror of Europe by having this kind of punitive settlement. And I was trying to tell them as an expert, don't do this. By the way, I was also advisor to Leonid Kuchma. So this is, people say to me every day now, you're a Putin apologist. This was years before President Putin came on the scene, obviously. And I was advisor to the Ukraine government the same way at the same time. They didn't want to help. This was now the U.S. unipolar world. And it was a little hard for me to understand because I was entranced with the idea of a world of peace, rather naive. Why not? Gorbachev had said, from Rotterdam to Vladivostok, this is a common economic home. This is a world of peace. I thought it was a pretty nice idea. And by the way, it was truly completely within reach. And
So,
we just didn't want it for a moment.
and I would add that the funds that would have been needed would not have been hugely high.
They were tiny. This was the
Exactly.
whole thing. Tiny. By the way, $1 billion for Poland. Okay, it was nice to get it in an 8-hour turnaround, but this is nothing. But the effect of it in enabling a currency to be stabilized and enabling a coherent economic program to go forward is enormous. It's not, I won't use the joke of economic stabilization because it'll be misunderstood by people. But I've been involved in many stabilizations. There's a little bit of magic involved in creating a framework of expectations and a little bit of money well put, well placed at the right moment goes an enormous distance because it's positively reinforced. And they refuse to do any of that in the case of first Gorbachev's Soviet Union in the last days of perestroika, and then in Yeltsin's new Russia, where Yeltsin said, and I sat across from him, we just want to be normal. We want to be a normal country in a normal time. Please help. I said, Mr. President, no problem. This is the most important development of the 20th century in geopolitics. This is obvious. And it not only was it not obvious, it was completely resisted by the US. And I would just add the other thing that, and there's several things that are important to understand how deep the underlying direction is and therefore how persistent it is and how these plans get set and then they get carried out when all the evidence runs the wrong way. You can see all of this forming. I could catch the glimpses of it early on, but then I would really encourage people to read Zbigniew Brzezinski's piece in Foreign Affairs in 1997, I think it's called A Strategy for Eurasia. And he spells out almost precisely the timeline for NATO enlargement, including to Ukraine. This is 1997. Putin's not on the scene. This has nothing to do with Putin. This is no reaction to Putin. This is years, and this is a decade, more than a decade, before the Bucharest NATO summit where the offer is made. And Brzezinski spells out exactly the timeline because these are deep plans. And another thing that people should look at is Wesley Clark, who was the NATO commanding general, because he went into the Pentagon on 2 occasions and came out completely shaken by the neocons who explained to Clark all the wars that the US was going to have to take out all of the governments that had been Soviet or Russian allies, Syria and Iraq and all the rest. This was a plan, long-standing. You don't have to be crazy. Just listen to what these people tell us. The problem is everything else is confidential, hidden, and the government lies nonstop about everything, nonstop. And so you have to be in the room to see it, or you have to know someone who is in the room, or you have to watch very closely to get the drift of this. But, all the people say, oh, it's nothing to do with NATO, blah, 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 blah. They don't know. How could they know? The New York Times has denied it for 20 years in this kind of pablum that the American people have been fed. So they have no data, no information, unless they're watching you guys. That's the basic point.